Konrad Curze didn't side with chaos. He rebelled against the Imperium, and that's a huge difference. Most overview content on the Horus Heresy doesn't make that distinction. The standard framing groups the 9 traitor legions into one block. Forces of chaos, armies that fought against the Emperor and lost. For 8 of those legions, that framing captures something real. For the Night Lords and their primarch, it's a category error, not a subtle nuance buried in supplemental lore. A foundational misclassification that changes everything about how you understand what Konrad Curze was, what drove him, and what his death meant. The correction runs 3 ways, and they're not the same argument dressed differently. He turned against the Imperium for political and moral reasons, not because chaos seduced him. He operated under a complete fatalist philosophy, built on precognitive visions he believed were utterly inevitable. And that philosophy explains more about his behavior than any corruption narrative ever could. And he didn't simply fail to worship chaos. He rejected it, actively, as something beneath him, a crutch for weaker men who needed something to hold on to. These 3 threads pull in the same direction, but each one does different work. Synthesizing them is how you arrive at an honest portrait of one of the most philosophically distinct figures in the Horus Heresy. All of it starts on Nostramo. Nostramo was a world of perpetual darkness, locked beneath an eternal solar eclipse. The light never reached it, not reduced to twilight, not dimmed to dusk, but functionally absent. The sky above the hive cities was permanent dark, industrial smog compounding the astronomical shadow, acid rain cutting through layers of pollution that hadn't cleared in generations. The planet's crust held enormous quantities of adamantium, which made the world theoretically prosperous. In practice, that wealth pooled at the top of a hierarchy so entrenched and so vicious that it might as well have been geology. Hundreds of billions lived in the hives, worked the mines, and received nothing but subsistence and violence in return. The suicide rate exceeded the birth rate. Murder for the sake of cannibalism was a recognized feature of life in the underhives, not an aberration. Konrad Curze's gestation capsule punched through the adamantium crust and fell toward the planet's core. The impact left a crater later regarded with fear and suspicion by the locals, who eventually closed it over. By some combination of volcanic venting and whatever the Emperor's genecraft does to a primarch's body in the first seconds of existence, he reached the surface. No family was waiting. No people adopted him. He ate vermin when he could find it, and the flesh of the dead when he couldn't, absorbing their memories through the neural material the way a primarch's omophagia works. And on Nostramo, every set of memories he consumed was another testimony to humanity's capacity for cruelty and despair. The visions started early, not occasionally, not in crisis moments, but constantly. Waking dreams of futures not yet arrived, specific and detailed and relentlessly dark. He had no framework to understand them, no one to explain the difference between a possible future and a certain one. They came, they passed, and many of them came true. On a world where everything was already as bad as it looked, the visions functioned as confirmation rather than warning. When he was large enough to move through the city with real force, he started killing criminals. At first, the logic was simple. He saw something wrong. He ended the person doing it. Gang leaders, corrupt officials, thieves caught in the act. He was a child, with the strength of something that had never existed on Nostramo before. And the gangs who sent kill teams after him found those teams reduced to the single messenger he left alive, eyeless, handless, with his tongue intact specifically to carry the message back. I am coming for you. The crime rate didn't fall. That was the problem. He killed more efficiently than anyone on Nostramo had ever killed, and the city carried on exactly as it had before. The answer, eventually, was that most people on Nostramo committed crimes to survive. Killing offenders one by one left the underlying conditions untouched. Fear of death wasn't sufficient deterrent for people who were already likely to die from other causes. So he changed the calculus. He would become something worse than death, something so specific in its horror, so impossible to ignore, so deeply embedded in what people saw and heard every day that the prospect of attracting his attention would be more terrible than starvation. What followed was methodical and visible. Corrupt officials were found hung from the facades of the administrative buildings where they'd worked, their faces left completely intact, not brutalized into anonymity, but recognizable, identifiable, so that every person walking past in the perpetual dark could look up and know exactly who they were looking at and exactly what that person had done. Gang leaders were discovered impaled on the spires of manufacturing rooftops, left until the acid rain and the darkness had finished with them. He broadcast the screaming of tortured criminals across the planetary communications network, through the picture interfaces built into every Nostraman home. The city didn't just see the consequences of crime. The city heard them, nightly, in the dark, in their own living spaces. The streets went quiet. Not peacefully quiet, fearfully quiet. The hive that had been defined by constant violence became a place where everyone maintained a self-imposed curfew, where mothers used his name to keep children in line, where the most powerful syndicate bosses simply stopped sending assassins because the kill teams never came back. Within a year, the crime rate in Nostramo Quintus fell to near zero. He described it himself, and the framing is important. Fear is the road to civilization. It's paved with bone and washed with blood, but the destination forgives the sin of the journey. He became the first monarch of Nostramo, governed with genuine temperance, shared wealth, reasonable administration, the kind of fairness that distinguished a ruler from a predator, until word of some injustice reached him, at which point he hunted the offender himself through the empty streets, wearing them down until they collapsed, then mutilating them in the specific way that left identification possible and lesson visible. Under his reign, adamantium exports tripled. The world that had been too broken to function became productive. He built order out of darkness, through terror alone, on a world that had given him nothing else to work with. This is what the emperor found when he arrived. The delegation came to Nostramo's capital on foot, 250,000 soldiers in formation, different cohorts in armor of black, gold, royal purple, and earthen gray, their rhythmic tread trembling the ground beneath them. Ahead of the soldiers walked 4 giants. Ahead of the giants walked the emperor, light incarnated in human skin, his soul fire uncontainable, the citizens of Nostramo looking away in crowds or going blind where they tried to hold his gaze. Most of them wept. Pale-faced people adapted to near constant darkness, seeing something approximating light for the first time in generations. The astropath who recorded the event noted it in her personal log. Strange omens in the cards, a king reversed at the feet of the emperor, the sign of hope reversed, death above everything, her own misgivings less than nothing against the force of his will. At the end of the broad road leading to Night Haunter's palace, Curze stood and waited. 4 primarchs stepped forward first. Rogel Dorn in wrought gold, white-haired, inclining his head with the bearing of a man who expected to be acknowledged as an equal. In the instant Curze looked at him, the vision arrived. Dorn dragged down in a dark tunnel, knives and swords wet with his blood, 100 murderers, the end of something enormous. Dorn said his name and waited. Curze said nothing. Lorgar Aurelian, in armor etched with 10,000 words, scripture running across every surface, grief in his eyes at the dark city and its unhealthy people. Curze looked at him and saw him crowned in psychic fire, screaming upward at a burning sky. Lorgar spoke his name with a voice like a hymn. Curze said nothing. Ferrus Manus, in dense, riveted black, with arms of living silver, his voice the grinding of a foundry's bowels. Curze saw this one's head clutched by empty eye sockets in another man's armored fingers. Ferrus Manus said his name. Curze said nothing. Fulgrim, in violet, silver-haired, the only one who smiled, the only one who met Curze's eyes with actual warmth. The vision he produced was barely visible, always slithering, never entirely present, something that wore death like a second skin and had long forgotten what it had been before. Fulgrim spoke his name. Curze said nothing. Then the Emperor stepped forward, arms open, and began to speak, and the vision that struck Curze at that moment was so potent and so horrifying that he went to his knees and tried to claw his own eyes out with his bare hands, trying to stop seeing what he was being shown. The Emperor's hand on his head, the pain dying, sanity returning in a pulse of mercy. He looked up at his father. "Konrad Curze, be at peace, for I have arrived and intend to take you home." "That isn't my name, father. I am Night Haunter." The Emperor had given him a name, the name his people had whispered half in fear and half in desperate prayer. Night Haunter was the one he kept until the end. That refusal at the very first meeting contains, in miniature, every refusal that followed. He joined the Great Crusade. He took command of the Night Lords, the 8th Legion, and for a period, the arrangement had a terrible logic. The Night Lords' reputation alone was enough to make planetary rulers clear their outstanding tithes, execute suspected heretics, and cease incipient rebellions before they fully formed. Planets capitulated before the first shot. That was how Curze understood warfare, not through destruction, but through the engineering of fear sufficient to make destruction unnecessary. He argued, with documented support in the lore, that his methods killed fewer people than conventional military compliance actions. "They called me a fiend because I terrorized worlds, but you just killed them. My reputation made planets capitulate when they heard my approach." He wasn't wrong about the numbers. The friction built as the crusade extended. Other primarchs found the Night Lords' methods disturbing, not at the level of policy, but at the level of excess. Brutality that persisted after submission had already been achieved. Cruelty that served no clear strategic purpose. Rogel Dorn objected most vocally, Vulcan most morally. The censure from the Emperor and the Council of Terra arrived. The Night Lords were doing things the Imperium officially disapproved of. That official disapproval, while the Great Crusade simultaneously destroyed worlds that refused compliance and killed billions of people who had never asked to be part of an Imperium they'd never heard of. That hypocrisy was the ember that had been smoldering in Curze since his naming on Nostramo's gate. In the Sherrott system, during a shared campaign with the Imperial Fists and the Emperor's children, word reached Curze that Nostramo had collapsed. The noble families, in his absence, had been draining their prisons and shipping the inmates to serve as Night Lords recruits, rather than sending the educated and capable young people he'd intended to select. Murderers and criminals had been filling his legion's ranks for years, changing its character from the inside. The world he'd built into something functional through a decade of terror had simply resumed its former shape the moment the terror was absent. He confided in Fulgrim about the visions he'd been having: civil war, the Emperor killing him, the legions locked in endless fratricidal conflict. Fulgrim, genuinely alarmed by his brother's state, told Rogel Dorn. Dorn confronted Curze over what he considered a slanderous claim against the Emperor's name. The confrontation came to blows. Curze beat Dorn bloody, wounded several Imperial Fists who tried to intervene, then accepted arrest and confinement while the council convened. Before any verdict, he escaped. He killed more of his brother's soldiers in the process and rejoined his fleet. In 984 of the 30th millennium, the Night Lord's fleet locked onto the weak point in Nostramo's adamantium crust, the same crater his original impact had carved decades earlier, and fired every weapon in its arsenal into that single point. The concentrated fire drove into the planet's core. The core overheated. Nostramo exploded. From orbit, a world died. The planet that had existed for billions of years, that had been everything he knew for the years that formed him, that he'd built into something functional through blood and terror, It came apart in fire and debris, the adamantium crust shattering outward across the system. Horus, when he heard, was reportedly shocked. Most of the primarchs were. From the outside, it looked like madness, a man destroying his own homeworld in a rage, a pointless act that served no strategic purpose and helped no one. From inside, whatever Curze was experiencing, it was a verdict. He had built order on Nostramo through fear alone, and he'd been proved right about something he'd probably always known. Fear of a present enforcer can't outlast the enforcer's presence. Remove the Night Haunter, and Nostramo reverted to what it had been, because nothing about the underlying conditions had changed. The corruption was structural. The world had failed to hold what he'd built. He sentenced it accordingly. This wasn't a chaos ritual. No god demanded it. No patron required or rewarded it. Horus was shocked by it precisely because it didn't serve the traitor cause, didn't advance any military or political objective, and seemed to operate entirely outside the logic of the war being prosecuted. It was a man rendering judgment on a world that had disappointed him. When the heresy formally broke out, Curze aligned with Horus. The exact timing is contested in the lore. Some accounts have him quick to swear loyalty once Horus's betrayal became publicly known, suggesting opportunism. Others suggest he'd already broken from the Imperium before any formal heresy began. The canon acknowledges the ambiguity directly. None can know his true reasons for joining the War Master's rebellion, whether it was a final attempt to break free of the fate he foresaw for himself and the Imperium, or simply a need to drown the visions in blood and motion. What the record establishes clearly is what his turn wasn't. Lorgar, the word-bearer, undertook a deliberate spiritual pilgrimage to find divine truth, found chaos, and through devout worship ascended to full demonhood, becoming the archpriest of the primordial truth and minister of chaos absolute. Fulgrim took a Slanesh-tainted sword as a war trophy, and in a moment of emotional vulnerability after killing Ferrus Manus, the greater demon within that sword possessed him completely, trapping his consciousness in a corner of his own mind, transforming his body into something four-armed and serpentine, a demon prince of Slanesh who now rules a demon world called Kallax inside the Eye of Terror. Both men were spiritually remade. Their allegiance wasn't switched. Their souls were reshaped from the inside out. Curze's soul wasn't reshaped. He remained exactly what Nostramo had made him, a man who believed civilization required fear, who had concluded that the emperor was a hypocrite, unwilling to face the reality of the means his vision demanded. The political grievance had a specific, documented canonical basis. He and the Night Lords were embittered by the emperor's and the Council of Terra's hypocrisy when they were censured for their brutality, even as the Great Crusade used military force to forcibly reunite the scattered worlds of humanity, regardless of those planets' own wishes. The Imperium killed worlds that refused to comply. Curze terrified them into compliance. His methods were more humane by the count of bodies. He believed the Imperium was doomed to corruption and tyranny, and the heresy just proved him right. His turn against the Emperor wasn't chaos offering power and apotheosis. It was an "I told you so," delivered in blood across half a galaxy. The political argument explains why he turned. His fatalism explains how he operated. Curze was a prescient, psychic foresight manifesting as visions and nightmares from the earliest years on Nostramo, never stopping, never becoming manageable. Constant, uncontrollable, threatening his sanity in ways no other primarch quite experienced from the same source. Sanguinius of the Blood Angels had something comparable, a winged primarch who also perceived futures, but the critical documented difference is this. Sanguinius understood that what he saw were possible futures, outcomes contingent on choices not yet made. Curze didn't see it that way. His visions arrived as certainties, fixed points, things that would happen regardless of what anyone did to prevent them. That single distinction reframes everything that followed. If futures are possible, Foreseeing a bad outcome creates an obligation to act. You intervene, you change things, you prevent what you saw. If futures are fixed, absolutely, immutably fixed, foreseeing a bad outcome changes nothing. You've been given a schedule, not a warning. Resistance is philosophically incoherent under that framework. You're living inside a sequence that was written before you were born, and the only honest response is to read your part. Curze built his entire existence around the second interpretation. The visions plagued him before he could contextualize them. On Nostramo, he saw futures in which mercy or hesitation led to outcomes worse than cruelty, which reinforced the methodology before he had the philosophical vocabulary to explain it. On the gate of his own palace, the first time he stood before his brothers and the emperor, he saw all their deaths in the initial moments of looking at them. Dorn, dragged down in the dark, Lorgar burning, Ferrus Manus's head in another man's grip, Fulgrim becoming something unrecognizable. He foresaw the Horus Heresy long before it happened, which is precisely why he told Fulgrim, which is precisely why the confrontation with Dorn that drove him rogue happened at all. He saw the deaths of the Imperial fists who tried to restrain him before he struck them. During the heresy itself, Curze infiltrated Imperium Secundus on Macragge and confronted Sanguinius directly. The exchange is revealing. He asked Sanguinius why the angel would choose to remain the emperor's slave when he knew his own death was written. Sanguinius refused the implicit escape. Curze then gave Sanguinius the chance to strike him down, right there, framing it explicitly. If fate could be changed, this was the moment to prove it. Sanguinius declined that too, pleading with the Night Haunter that redemption was still possible. Curze set off an explosive trap and disappeared into Macragge's depths. That scene captures his philosophy in action. He wasn't offering mercy. He was testing the premise of his entire worldview. And Sanguinius's refusal to act was, from his perspective, more evidence that everything was already decided. Later, on the journey toward Terra, with Sanguinius holding him captive aboard the Red Tier, Curze was sealed in a stasis coffin and jettisoned into deep space. Sanguinius declaring that just as he was about to meet his own destiny, Curze must follow his foreseen path. Even the angel, who believed in free will, operated as though Curze's death by an assassin's hand was already written. The primarch, who most believed in the possibility of change, treated Curze's fate as fixed. Magnus the Red, another primarch whose relationship to chaos defies the simple traitor label, having become a demon prince of Tzeentch, not through willing conversion, but as a cascading consequence of using forbidden sorcery to warn the emperor of Horus's treachery, once gave Curze an artifact specifically designed to help him. Curze's orb, cataloged in the Legion's artifacts, was meant to help him focus his precognitive visions and make the gift of foresight something manageable rather than something that degraded sanity. Curze never felt the need to use it. The orb eventually passed to the Night Lords as a Legion relic, used by his sons to scry possible futures in battle. He left it untouched. That detail sits exactly right. He was offered a tool to control the torment that had defined his existence since Nostramo. He declined. He didn't want his visions controlled. They weren't a problem to be solved. They were the truth, and the orb was for someone who hadn't yet accepted the truth. The Emperor, in a confrontation preserved across multiple lore sources, reportedly told Curze that he had made one fundamental mistake, that he had chosen to believe in immutable fate. Curze rejected that framing entirely. He believed the Emperor had engineered all of it, the scattering of the Primarchs as infants, his life on Nostramo, the heresy, his own eventual death. The Emperor calling that belief a mistake was, from Curze's perspective, just another component of the scheme, the final insult before the scheduled ending. The genuinely open question, the one the canon declines to resolve and the fandom has argued about for years, is whether his fatalism was a coherent philosophical system or a psychological wound that had grown too large to be anything else. He was broken by Nostramo in ways the other primarchs weren't. No human warmth in his formation, no family, no community, no one who had ever valued him for reasons other than fear. He entered the Great Crusade already convinced that the worst possible outcome was the only possible outcome. And as his behavior worsened, the visions likely darkened accordingly. Atrocities feeding darker visions, feeding more atrocities. A spiral in one direction with no mechanism to reverse. Was that conviction genuine philosophical insight, or the final rationalization of a mind the darkness had consumed? The story doesn't say. It shouldn't. That question is the one the lore hands directly to the audience, and the Night Haunter wouldn't resolve it even if he could. The third angle sharpens the portrait most precisely. Curze didn't simply fail to worship chaos, he found it contemptible. Most analyses of the traitor legions track which patron was chosen, which mark was received, which transformation was accepted. For the word-bearers and Emperor's children, that is essentially the entire story. For the World Eaters and Death Guard, chaos reshaped their primarchs and their cultures so thoroughly that any pre-chaos identity is largely theoretical. Even the Iron Warriors, who fought for strategic and material reasons rather than religious ones, now have Perturabo elevated as a demon prince. The Night Lords occupy a different position in every taxonomy that tries to be precise. Most of the legions scorned all forms of faith and respected only temporal and material power. Many considered themselves free of chaos corruption and held those they deemed corrupted in contempt. Curze didn't fall to chaos during the heresy. He didn't receive apotheosis to demonhood. That's not an interpretive claim. It's stated directly in every primary lore source that covers the question. During the heresy, when Curze encountered demon-possessed word-bearers among his nominal allies, he told them to stay away from him. That's the active rejection detail, not a passive absence of chaos allegiance, but a response to its presence. A man who saw what chaos did to the people fighting beside him and found it repellent rather than compelling. The Night Lords codified that stance as a point of institutional pride, articulated plainly in one of the Legion's own declarations. Our brothers run to the edges of the Imperium to cower in the shadows of the dark gods that protect them. Only we, the Night Lords, the sons of Konrad Curze, are strong enough to stand alone. We don't need their gifts, not passivity. A deliberate posture, independence framed as strength, chaos dependency framed as cowardice. Whatever Curze taught his legion about what they were, part of what he taught them was that needing the ruinous powers was something to be ashamed of. In the Black Library novel, Lord of the Night, by Simon Spurrier, there's a Night Lord's debate about Curze and chaos that captures the complexity honestly. One voice insists, "He spurned chaos. He chose me." The next responds with a single word, "No." The argument doesn't resolve, even within the fiction. One character believes Curze rejected chaos in favor of something else. Another denies it entirely. The question of why he didn't fall is treated as genuinely contested in the lore. The question of whether he fell isn't. Chaos corrupts through desires and doubts. It needs something to grip: ambition, fear of death, hunger for power, spiritual emptiness waiting to be filled. Lorgar had a desperate need for divine meaning. A primarch who worshipped the Emperor with genuine devotion, then had that devotion publicly repudiated and went searching for something that would receive it. Fulgrim had an obsession with perfection and a vanity the demon in that sword could exploit. Even Horus was worked on through his pride and his fear of irrelevance once the crusade ended. Curze didn't want anything. He had already concluded that everything he might want was doomed. His nihilism was total. No ambition for empire, no fear of oblivion worth naming, no spiritual longing that hadn't been murdered by a childhood spent alone on Nostramo, eating vermin and absorbing the memories of the dead. The ruinous powers trade in promises: power, survival, meaning, transformation, and Curze had constructed, out of decades of visions and rage and philosophical despair, a worldview in which none of those offers meant anything. You can't tempt a man who has decided the offer is a lie, and the liar is a mechanism he's seen operate before. He'd grown up on a world run entirely by those kinds of offers. He'd spent his adult life punishing the people who made them. One important caveat: the Night Lords, as a post-Curze legion, did drift. Individual members gave themselves to chaos across the following millennia. Some warbands acknowledge chaos undivided. The legion fractured into competing factions, some retaining his ethos, others abandoning it entirely. That's a story about the legion after his death. It doesn't change what Curze himself was. The world he chose to die on was Segwalsa, in the Eastern Fringe, a world the Night Lords had made into a fortress after Horus's defeat. Its architecture eventually built not from stone and metal alone, but from the flesh of the conquered, dark corridors hung with the evidence of what the 8th Legion had always been. The Carrion world. The heresy was over. The other traitor legions were retreating to the Eye of Terror, broken and diminished, carrying their failure toward the only sanctuary that would take them. Curze retreated to Segwalsa and waited for what he'd known was coming. The fortress was a monument to everything the Night Lords were. Its corridors ran with the sounds the Legion lived for, distant echoes from the deep chambers, the architectural declaration of a people who had never intended to be anything other than what they were. Sons of Nostramo moved through those corridors, dark blue armor in the perpetual dark, brass fittings catching what little light existed, awaiting orders that would come in a form none of them expected. Before he waited, Curze wrote, "The Dark," a tome containing his memoirs, his visions, his beliefs, written in human blood. He completed it shortly before his death and hid it in a crevasse in the fortress walls, where its current whereabouts remain unknown in the lore. Not preserved for later discovery, hidden. A man wanting to have said the full thing, on record somewhere, regardless of whether anyone would read it. The accounting completed before the account closed. On the night of his fated death, he built an effigy of the emperor out of the corpses of mutilated slaves. Whatever that act meant internally, what it shows externally is clear. In his final hours, he was thinking about his father. Returning, one last time, to the argument that had driven his existence since he'd stood on Nostramo's gate and refused the name being offered. He had known about Mishen since her craft entered the Eastern Fringe, not in the vague way of a primarch sensing something on the wind. Specifically, the Calidus assassin moving toward him through the void, carrying her mission on a ship he could track in his visions with the same precision he'd tracked every other scheduled event of his life. He knew her temple, Calidus, the shape-shifting, surgically modified operatives of the Officio Assassinorum. He knew her weapon, a Catan phase sword, a blade of necrodermis that phased in and out of real space, capable of bypassing any protection. He knew the outcome. He issued the command to his sons, "Don't intercept the ship. Stand down. Let her come." He told Talos, the apothecary of the 10th Company, the man his visions identified as the Soul Hunter, the one who would eventually pursue Mishen across the galaxy and kill her in the manner of the Night Lords, that he needed to die and that he would embrace death gladly so that the Emperor could prove him right. That phrasing is exact. He wasn't accepting defeat, he was accepting proof. His entire argument against the Emperor was that imperial justice was no different from his own, power punishing those it had judged guilty, using the methods that served it, regardless of its claims to higher principles. The Emperor who had censured the Night Lords for brutality while simultaneously destroying non-compliant worlds. The Emperor sending an assassin to kill him was the Emperor doing precisely what Curze had always done, finding the guilty and ending them. The asymmetry the Imperium insisted on, the difference between Night Haunter's terror and the Emperor's order, would be erased the moment the blade came down. Mishen walked through corridors with no guards. The Night Lords had received his order. They stood aside. Some watched her pass. Some looked away. The Primarch they had followed, the genetic father of their line, had decided this was how it ended, and there was nothing in their conditioning that could override a direct command delivered by a man who had already seen the outcome and accepted it. She entered the throne room. Curze was waiting, without surprise, without fear, without the adrenaline of a man who had not yet reconciled himself to what was about to happen. He had been waiting for this for years, possibly decades. The appointment was long overdue. His final words, recorded in the assassin's video log and later recovered by the Night Lords, duplicated and disseminated throughout the shattered legion so that his sons could hear their Primarch speak for the first time in 10,000 years. Your presence does not surprise me, assassin. I have known of you ever since your craft entered the eastern fringes. Why did I not have you killed? Because your mission and the act you are about to commit proves the truth of all I have ever said or done. I merely punished those who had wronged, just as your false emperor now seeks to punish me. Death is nothing compared to vindication. Mishen killed him. She is the only mortal in recorded history known to have killed a Primarch. He let her. He had also foreseen what came next. Mishen fleeing with trophies from his body, his sons disobeying his final orders, Talos pursuing her across the galaxy and eventually catching and killing her in the manner of the Night Lords. He knew not just his own death, but the death of the woman who killed him. The full sequence was known to him in advance. He'd told Talos what would happen. Talos killed her anyway, cut her apart on a world far from Sagwalsa. Years later, exactly as the visions had shown. The records from the Calidus Temple frame the assassination with unusual precision. Curze allowed himself to be killed, to vindicate his decisions to destroy Nostramo and to rebel against the Emperor. And because while he believed his actions had been right, he knew they also damned him. He held both things simultaneously, rightness and damnation, conviction and self-condemnation. He didn't resolve the contradiction. He sat inside it and waited for the blade. Place that death alongside the trajectory of every other Primarch who crossed to the traitor side. Lorgar still exists in the Eye of Terror, a full demon prince, having finally found the divine meaning he'd sought his entire life. Fulgrim persists as a four-armed, serpentine horror, ruling the demon world Kallax, the original man he was trapped in a corner of that demonic body. Magnus the Red continues on the planet of sorcerers, planning campaigns and pursuing knowledge, a consciousness 10,000 years old, still accumulating. Mortarion persists. Angron persists, resurrected after his destruction on Armageddon. They accumulate. They continue. The ruinous powers offered perpetual existence in exchange for service, and the Primarchs who took that offer are still there. Chaos-aligned Primarchs don't choose death. They choose continuation, mutation, apotheosis, transformation, anything that preserves the self against the extinction waiting for everyone else. Curze chose death, consciously, with foreknowledge extending back decades. With time to prevent it, means to prevent it, loyal sons surrounding him who would have died to prevent it. He chose death because, under the terms of his own philosophy, death was the only honest conclusion available. It proved the argument. It vindicated the life. The lore states this directly in Guy Haley's 2019 novel, Konrad Curze, The Night Haunter. If fate weren't locked in iron, he willingly chose this death. Willingly. Not resigned, not defeated. Chosen. The distinction that matters most is this: traitor to the Imperium and servant of chaos aren't synonyms. They describe two completely different relationships to power. The Horus Heresy made it easy to conflate them because chaos engineered the Civil War, and most of the traitor Primarchs ended up aligned with the ruinous powers in one form or another. The conflation has a logic. But most isn't all. and the exceptions have content. Traitor to the Imperium means loyalty switched, broke from the Emperor, fought on the losing side of the Civil War. That's a statement about military and political allegiance. Curze absolutely satisfies it. He participated in the drop site massacre on Istvan V. He waged campaigns against loyal worlds throughout the heresy. He fought his brothers and killed people in their service. He is legitimately, correctly, a traitor. Servant of Chaos means spiritual and ideological allegiance to the ruinous powers, seeking their gifts, accepting their patronage, being remade in their image, choosing to exist within their economy of power. Curze satisfies none of it. He brought no offering. He sought no patron. He accepted no transformation. He didn't even use an artifact his brother gave him to help manage his own suffering. He declined to let the orb give him relief because the visions were the truth, and relief from the truth was the one thing he wasn't willing to accept. Applying the Chaos Traitor label to Curze and leaving it there imports Horus's story onto a man whose actual story is almost the opposite. Horus's arc is a seduction narrative, a loyal son corrupted by powers that needed him to break and did the patient work of breaking him. Curze's arc is a political rebellion narrative driven by grievance that predated the heresy and operated entirely outside the framework of chaos wanting anything from him. The label does real conceptual work for most of the nine. For the Night Lords and their primarch, it gets the story wrong at a foundational level. What Curze actually was is harder to name cleanly than what he wasn't. A rebel whose grievance against the Emperor was